Mr. Stacy, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well today. Thank you. And you, Christopher?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Hopefully everyone's doing okay today.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful day, and it's a lot cooler today, that's for sure.
It is a lot cooler. I'm happy because usually it's been raining all that lately.
Yes, it has. And I'm thankful for that, aren't you?
Oh, I am. It was so hot yesterday.
Yes, ma'am, it was. It was hot enough where I didn't even like having to get out of my truck.
Yeah, it makes you kind of miserable.
Yes, ma'am, it does.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, we're here on a serious and sensitive subject today. We're going to be discussing grieving and death and stuff like that. So my first question for you, Mr. Stacy, how do you believe? Okay, what are the stages of grief? Let me ask you that.
You know, that's a good question. The first thing that I'd like to say in regards to that is when you use the word stages, grief is not linear, okay?
Okay.
It is holistic in its approach. It's different from each person. But there does seem to be a process that we need to work through, okay? And I think one of the best examples of that process that I see most often in what I do is found actually in a book entitled The 6 Needs of the Mourner.
Okay.
And Dr. Alan Wofelt paints that picture this way, and I think he is spot on based upon the thousands of individuals that I have spent time with who have lost a loved one. And he says the first part of the process, or the first need, is to acknowledge the reality of the death.
Right.
And understanding in that acknowledgement that there is a head acknowledgement and there is a heart acknowledgement as well.
It's a difference.
Yes. Grief is a heart thing. And so sometimes it's easy for us in our head to say they're gone, but yet in our hearts we haven't fully accepted that. So the first part of the process is accepting the reality of the death. The second part of the process is embracing the pain of the loss. Many times what we try to do out of self-preservation, obviously, is avoid pain.
Right.
But in regards to death and in regards to grief, it is important that we allow ourselves to feel that, and that we understand that those feelings that we have are because of love.
Right.
We have lost someone that we love. And so for us to have pain because of that is a normal thing. The next thing to do is to remember the person has passed. A lot of times we use the word ritual to describe that, or funeral ceremony, or life celebration. It is important for us to stop and in some form or fashion recognize the life of our loved ones, celebrate that life, and then also let others minister to us during that time, friends and families, where we get together and we laugh and we cry and we share stories. That's a big part of the healing process as well, Christopher. Another part of it is developing a new identity. And sometimes that can come across sounding harsh, but the reality is that if I lost my spouse tomorrow, my identity has changed, whether I accept that or not.
Okay.
I will always be married to my wife in my heart,
Right.
but the physical reality of that has changed. And so my identity as a human being in the physical has changed too. And many times what we see in the grieving process and what I hear is individuals will look at me and they'll say, Stacy, I just want things to be normal again. When in all actuality, what was normal when our loved one existed will never be normal again. Who we were when they existed will be different than who we are now, simply because they're not present. And so understanding that and embracing that new identity is important as we move forward. That's a big part of the process.
I got one more question.
Sure.
Well, a quick question. How do people accept change? I feel like, so like you said, people always want to be normal, but like you can really never go back to normal because that person is not going to be there for the needs that person gave you. you're not gonna have those needs anymore.
Right.
Well, you still gonna have those needs, but they're not gonna be fulfilled. So how does that person accept change?
Well, I think one of the ways that we accept change is by embracing a healthy grieving process, because change is at the center of grief. It's massive change.
Right.
In most cases, the biggest change we ever experience in life when we lose a loved one, right?
Right.
And so as we embrace that change and as we work through the grieving process, that's how we change over time. Because if we don't allow ourselves to be changed by what's taken place, then we get stuck.
Mm.
You often hear people refer to it, or I do, as stuck in my grief or stuck grief. And so we just get stuck because we're unwilling to embrace the pain or embrace the process or embrace the change.
Mm.
Now, I talk about these things, but at the same time, they happen over time.
Right.
You know, you've heard people say probably before, time changes all things. Well, I don't think that's true. It's what we do with time.
Right.
And grief is the same way. And so as we begin to understand that we have changed and there is a new identity, because I'm no longer her husband or his wife or her son, right?
Right.
That has changed, so my identity has changed as well. And then search for meaning. We can find meaning in death. There is meaning there if we look. Sometimes it can be difficult to find depending on the circumstances around the death. But it is definitely there. And then the last part of that process is to receive ongoing support, because it is important for us to have a safe place or safe people to share what's going on inside.
Right.
Okay? And real quick, that word, we hear the words bereavement, grief, and mourning, right? And they actually do have different meanings. The word bereavement means to lose or to have something forcefully taken away. And so we say a person is bereaved. They have lost a loved one. Now that can also mean they've lost a limb, they've lost their health, they've lost a spouse in divorce. So bereavement can speak to a lot of loss. The loss of a pet. Grief are those inner feelings and emotions that are a byproduct of that loss. And then mourning is the outward expression of those internal feelings that are produced in regards to the loss. And so that's the three primary words, and really kind of, what they denote.
Because I know whenever I was dealing with grief, well, my great grandmother passed. She actually passed here at this facility.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that.
Right. When she passed, it was weird because, I know my uncles were down and everything, and then whenever, she said she wanted nobody in the room with her when she passed. I don't think she wanted people to really grieve, because, like I said, she was never big on telling people she was sick.
Right.
'Cause I think she understood that other people are going through life as well, and I feel like she didn't want to be a burden on anybody.
Right.
'Cause I feel like she was always that kind of person. So whenever the last couple of days when she was here, I brought her a bouquet of flowers. I set it right there next to me. Like I said, I don't know if she's seen it, but in my mind she's seen it. And then I read her a book called Washington Black. Well, I never finished the book. I got a couple chapters in, but I read for her for 2 days. In her final moments, I was there with her. I was reading the book. I was mispronouncing words left and right. But, when she passed, I cried for maybe 10, 15. I walked around outside, and then I was really okay after that. I think because, I learned that it was okay to let go.
Sure. And that death is a part of life.
It is part of life.
There's birth and there's death, and that's a reality. And I love that story because as you were talking about being present and reading the book and spending time with your grandmother, to me what those were expressions of love and gratitude for what she meant to you,
right,
and the impact that she had on your life. And and you and I talked about this, can there be beauty in death? And I've got a few thoughts I was going to share if we have time in a minute. And the answer to that is yes, there can. And one of the beautiful things about death, you just painted a picture of it, but also Your grandmother still lives because she lives in your heart and your mind.
Right.
And she influences the things that you do and don't do.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a beautiful thing because it's a reflection of a loving, genuine relationship between two people. And that is, as I said, I think, a very beautiful thing.
It's a very beautiful thing.
It is.
Yes, ma'am, it is, isn't it?
Mom,
It is.
Mom, anything you want to add?
Well, I did want to comment just on something that touched me personally a moment ago, was when you were mentioning how you change as a person, because like my grandmother, she raised me, so she was like my mom basically.
Yes, ma'am.
And so one of the things that, and this has been, she passed away, it'll be 2 years this month,
Right.
June 30th.
Okay.
And I'm just now, I guess my process took a little longer because I'm just now processing. I feel like it hit me that I'm no longer someone's little girl. I mean, I know I'm an adult, but to her, I was always her little girl.
Sure.
And now I kind of felt a little lost out there because I didn't have that support anymore.
Right.
I didn't have that relationship. I didn't have somebody that I could tell anything to, or anything that happened to me, whatever was going on, there was no judgment or anything like that. You know, I could go to her for anything. And when I lost that relationship, someone that had always been there, it was I felt a little lost.
Yes, ma'am. And I would have been surprised had you shared otherwise. It's normal, as I'm sure you know, to feel that way when we lose someone we love, especially a parent.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So you said you wanted to touch base on something.
Yeah, we were, as we were talking just a minute ago, I was doing some reviewing for our visit today.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I do from time to time when I'm asked to speak in places on grief, and one of the questions is, what are some things that we've learned from grief? And I wanted to speak to that for just a moment, just a couple of them. I won't expound on them all, but here are some of the lessons learned from grief that I have learned in my journey and also from visiting with others, such as you and your mom as well, is that grief teaches us spontaneity in life, that it's okay to be spontaneous and
Never
to
thought
just
about it
go
like
with
that.
life. Yeah, you know, grief teaches us the value of time,
It does.
right? Grief teaches us, I believe, the need for simplicity, because it brings us back to the very basics of birth and death, right? And so sometimes life gets real complicated when in all actuality, it should be simple.
I've always said that. For my mind, I was like, I should boil it down to the simplest form and just leave it there. 'Cause I feel like life is so full of different things going on, flying around every day.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to keep things simple. Like you said, when it comes to a death, that's one of the simple things.
Yes.
Birth and death.
Yes, and the other part of it too is when life gets real complicated, those complications can tend to pull us away from the most important thing, and those are relationships with other people.
Right.
And so what ends up happening, and what I hear often is from individuals, I wish I had spent less time doing and more time with my loved one who's now gone. And so that's where the idea of simplicity, comes from. And I hear that quite a bit. Here's another one, the benefits of change. We talked about change.
Right.
And change can be very difficult to embrace, especially in the grief process. However, it's that change that helps to transform us in regards to that new identity and what our future is going to look like as we move forward.
Right.
Another one's the value of sharing. You just shared to a certain degree, about your loss, and I believe that is so important to verbalize and share those thoughts and feelings and what we're learning from that journey. Would you agree with that as well?
I do. And the journey for each individual person, from my experience, is different. I know that the way I reacted and the way I'm still grieving is, I know this time last year, I had a lot of sadness around this time.
Yes, ma'am.
And then I had feeling some sadness this year as well. And sometimes I would think to myself, well, should this be easing up now? You can't really put a time frame on it. So I'm just kind of letting it flow on its own. But sometimes I do have doubts in my mind, should I be in a better place with it by now? That's one of my things that I kind of struggle with.
How many years were you in relationship with your grandmother before she passed?
From birth to 44 years.
Okay. And you said it has been 2 months since she passed.
No.
2 years.
2 years.
2 years.
Yes, sir.
Even with 2 years, two thoughts. 2 years in regards to a 40-plus year relationship
Right.
is a short period of time. It really
Okay.
is. And here's the other thing too, is I hear this frequently. When will I get past this? Right?
Right.
Grief is not something that we ever get past or conquer. Grief is something that we learn to walk with or live with. Now, the pain lessens over time as we process the grief in a healthy way. But the reality is that we will always grieve to a certain degree because we loved.
Right.
And we don't stop loving someone just because they had died.
Correct.
And one of the best expressions of that I've ever heard comes from a mentor and friend of mine, Wes Bynum, who says that there will forever be an invisible scarlet thread that connects our heart to the heart of the one that has died and that is no longer with us in the physical.
That's very worth it.
Thank you. And again, thank you for sharing. And then the last part of that is, many people talk about the need to expand their family of choice, because as we begin to understand and develop that new identity, there are gaps, there are empty areas, silos, if you will, that other people can step into, that we enter into relationship with, that can help us in those areas. And then the last thing, that one of the big lessons that we learn from loss is the worth of relationships. Because it's like anything else. Sometimes we don't realize how important someone was to us,
Right.
or the significance of the impact of their life on us until they're gone.
Right.
And so that's why I say that relationships often become much more valuable when we've lost someone that we love to death.
But that's very well put. Cause I'm saying things like everybody, I feel like a lot of people are still stuck in grief years and years and years. But then again, like you said before, there's no time limit you can put on grief. Like you say, you just learn. Do you just ultimately just accept grief? That's up to you. Is that something like I feel like I can't? I feel like when I grieve, I feel like my grief is based off of I think about it in a wrong way. I think when I think of grief, I think of it like in the sense of like it's a part of life, but I just can't let go of that person because I do still love that person.
Absolutely.
I just can't let them go. 'Cause I feel like when people think death, I feel like they say, "Oh, that person's gone. I can just forget about them."
Right.
But I mean, they lived a life though.
Exactly. Exactly. And that life impacted your life.
Correct.
And always will.
It will always will.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I would like to comment on when you mentioned you realize after the person has passed away, the importance of that relationship in your life. And I know when my grandmother passed away, I lost some confidence, and I think it was because when I look back on it, I knew she was like my rock.
Yeah.
So it was like no matter what happened, I know I had somebody
Right.
that I could always go to. And when I didn't have that rock and that strength, that's when I felt it, because I was like, I'm on my own now. I know I have God, and I pray, and I know that, but when you don't have that go-to rock and strength, you've got to become stronger on your own, really, because you don't have that go-to anymore.
Right. Right. Very, very, very well said. Again, thank you. Very well said.
Yeah, I definitely can relate to that.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
Let me ask you this. Whenever people are grieving, I was one that I put this down to one of the questions. How do you explain death to a kid?
That's something that, first of all, I'm very thankful that here at the Hospice of East Texas, we have a child bereavement specialist that works with children and with parents that have kids in the home when there's a spouse or a family member in the process of dying or has died. And I brought some things with me, and I'd like to share just a few thoughts in regards to that. And of course, y'all, please interject at any given time. The first thing is to speak openly and honestly about the death.
Okay.
And to avoid euphemisms like we lost them, or they went to sleep, or they've moved on. We're better off saying things in this way, even though it's very difficult. Honey, I have some very sad news.
All right.
Uncle John died. And so to be open and gentle and honest about that. The other thing is to listen. Without judging, but just listen and provide a safe place for that child to express themselves, right? And what's most helpful, as I said, is to listen without judging, without interpreting, or without evaluating, and just let them share. That's important for adults as well. Another one is to be open to different ways of grieving and keeping in mind that we grieve differently.
Right.
If you and I were brothers and we had the same mom and our mom died, I would expect that you're going to grieve different than me because we're two different people, uniquely different individuals, even though we're related.
Right.
And our relationship with mom was different because we're different. And so we're going to grieve different. And children grieve differently as well. And you can help children by letting them know that all their thoughts and feelings are okay and that it's okay to share them. Another one is to offer choices. One of the things that happens, and your mom spoke to it just a moment ago very well, is when someone dies, depending on who it is and what the relationship is, it can make us feel just powerless, right? Like we have control over, right? Like we have control over nothing anymore. Well, children can feel that same way, and so giving them opportunities to have power. For example, would you like to wear your blue jeans today or your sweatpants? They get home from school, would you like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? So giving them the opportunity, the power, if you will, to make decisions. Another one is to provide outlets for self-expression. Children tend to express their grief through play, whether it's coloring, drawing, playing a game, and while that's going on, they express their grief through those activities, okay?
Okay.
So here's another one. Talking about the person that has passed is very important. Using their name. One of the things that I hear often from adults, not as much from children, from adults, is nobody ever says daddy's name anymore. Nobody ever says grandma's name anymore. And so it's important for us as parents to be sure and talk about that person with the child and let them tell stories about grandpa or grandma or mom and dad. And then one of the other ones too is to provide consistency and to provide routine. And again, I think that ties back into the powerlessness to a certain degree, in that when someone we love dies, we feel like everything's out of control. And so routine for a child and scheduling for a child is important. Maybe it's a bedtime routine, maybe it's a morning routine, whatever it is, making sure that the routines that existed prior to the death are in place to the best of our abilities, and then some new routines just to make sure that there is still structure and that feeling of safety for the child.
Something you guys said, sorry to cut you off.
No, please do.
Something you said that I thought about, when you said a lot of people don't bring up the person's name, I know that a lot of family members don't bring up that person's name at all. It's like they just forget about it and just let it go. Like a lot of people don't say my big mama's name at all.
Yes.
Like they'll say it every blue moon, but that's not like, me and my mom talk about granny here and there. And we'll talk about like, oh, she used to tell these stories, but other people, they just don't bring up the name at all. They just won't bring it up.
Exactly. That is common. It is common. And I started to say many times, I can't say that often, I think is probably a better choice of words.
Okay.
People won't bring it up because they'll think, well, if I bring their name up, then I'm going to upset Christopher.
Right.
Or I'm going to upset Stacy. If I talk about Herschel Sanders, Stacy's dad, then that's just going to upset Stacy, and I don't want to upset him. When in all actuality, more often than not, when someone that we love died, we want to hear their name.
Right.
We want to hear stories about how they impacted the lives of other people and the difference that they made in their family and in the world in which they live. But you're right. Often people will go out of their way to not bring it up so that they won't upset a family member or stir up their own
Emotions.
Exactly.
Right.
They'll avoid it. That's a way of avoiding it.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
And I've often wondered about it. I'm not sure if it's a normal process or not, but is there, I think at times, can there be another part of the process is feeling some guilt? I feel like I would look back on the situation and be like, I wish I would have spent more time with her in those final days.
Yes, ma'am.
Or could I have done something different?
Yes, ma'am. That is normal. And it is very common.
Okay.
And the thing about that is, you know, the old saying, hindsight's 20/20.
It is.
That is definitely true.
It is true.
When someone we love dies. But here's the thing to keep in mind about that.
Okay.
What I have found is it's easy to look back with a different perspective and say, I wish I'd have done this or I wish I'd have done that. Very common and normal. The reality is, for most of us, when we were in the midst of that situation or that relationship, we did the best that we could at the time based on what we knew. Right? So to hold ourselves hostage because we know more now than we did then.
Got you.
Right?
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes there is guilt that is substantial and possibly supported for a reason, right? That needs to be worked through. And there's different things that can be done in that arena. But that general feeling of guilt because we look back knowing more now than we did then is very common.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, it's a great question.
Oh, I had a question to ask you about when it comes to, let's say, the after death, like the person already moved on. What would be like process? Because I know we discussed the last time. We said we go through the funeral home, cremation, stuff like that.
Right.
I know that's a sensitive subject, but I feel like that's something that needs to be speaked on. Because like a lot of people, like I said, their world gets turned upside down.
Yes.
So a lot of them don't know what to do.
Yes.
So what are some options for people to better take care of the deceased loved one?
You know, one of the most helpful things is to address those things before we die.
Right.
Right? And that can be done a multitude of ways. It can be in a will. It can be done through a pre-arrangement with a funeral home. It can be done by sitting down, talking to family and saying, these are my wishes. But in general, what happens once we die, we determine what funeral home we want to do.
Mm-hmm.
That funeral home is then contacted, and that contact is made depending on the circumstances around the death, can be made by different individuals. But in this case, whether it's a family member calling or say a nurse calling or a justice of the peace calling, the funeral home then comes and takes that individual into their care and takes them back to the funeral home. One of the questions that will be asked usually when your loved one is being taken into the care of the funeral home is, would you like embalming? Because that's one of those things that the sooner that can be done, the better. But the thing is, that doesn't have to be done unless there's going to be a public viewing. If there's going to be no visitation, or if the casket is going to be closed during the visitation and the service, then embalming is not required. But if there's going to be a public viewing, then embalming is necessary. So that's something to think about.
Correct.
In regards to cremation, embalming is not required unless, because in cremation, there's generally, most funeral homes are generally going to have three options. I think most of your audience understands traditional funerals.
Correct.
Right? Cremations are definitely on the rise. And part of that has to do with cost. Now, you can do a direct cremation with no services, right? You can do a cremation and memorial service where the urn is present. Sometimes the cremains are in the urn, sometimes they're not. It just depends on the scheduling of the cremation. And then there's also, most funeral homes offer what is referred to as a life celebration. And that is, the loved one is embalmed, they're placed in a casket, there's a visitation with body present and viewable. There's a funeral service where the casket would be opened again if the family chose, in the traditional filing by of those that are present. But the difference is, when that's over, you don't go to the cemetery. That casket and your loved one is taken back to the back, and they're taken out of the casket, cremated, and then the cremains are returned to the family. So those are the three general options within cremation. And I would also say this, that there are price differences. And funeral homes typically will have those prices on their webpage where you can go and look, or you can call and ask them. And that's how that takes place. There's something else that I run into quite a bit that I'd like to share. We'll take but just a second.
Go ahead.
On the cremation side, in the state of Texas, you have to have the family member, next of kin, has to sign an authorization cremation form. You have to have the death certificate, and there's a 48-hour waiting period. Many times people think that once their loved one is taken into the care of the funeral home, they go to the funeral home, they're immediately cremated. That's not the case. There's a 48-hour waiting period in the state of Texas. Let's say, for instance, the family gets back together and they just say, you know what, cremation is just not what we want. Like I say, there's that waiting period, just a little bit of time to process it and make sure this is what you want, because obviously cremation is not reversible.
Right.
So you have your traditional service that most are comfortable with, and then on the cremation side, three options being direct cremation of services, a memorial service with the urn present, or a life celebration, body present for visitation, body present for the service, but you don't go to the cemetery. Your loved one's then cremated after that, and then those cremains would be returned to the family.
Right.
Yeah.
I have one more topic. When it comes to the cremations, I know when my great grandmother passed, she always said she wanted to be cremated, and I actually got her ashes in my necklace.
Yes, cremation jewelry is a very popular thing nowadays.
So could you possibly, I feel like a lot of people feel like that's weird to get cremations and do that. How do you, how do you, I feel like it's not that weird. I feel like that person's with me all the time. I wear the jewelry.
Absolutely. And just like grieving, in regards to cremation jewelry, everyone's different. There are those that say, no, I'm not. That's not me. I'm not interested in that. And then there are those, such as yourself, myself as well, that's significant and it's important. And it's a way for my loved one to remain with me to a certain degree in the physical, right?
Right.
Because I have those cremains in this necklace or in this ring or whatever the cremains may be put into. So I have heard people say that's weird, but it comes down to personal preference.
Right.
And if an individual finds that to be comforting and a healthy part of their grieving process, I think it is a healthy thing to do. That's my personal opinion.
I appreciate it.
I had a comment on, since we're talking about the cremation ashes, and like you said, every individual is different. For example, when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother wanted me to keep his ashes here at my house.
Yes, ma'am.
She didn't want to keep the ashes
down
there with her. And, I'm not sure why. I don't know if it was just a part of how she was handling things. So I kept his ashes up here. And every time she would come up here, she called him Big Head. That was her nickname for him. And she'd always wake up and say, "Good morning, Big Head." And I have her ashes up here as well. So for me, there was nothing ever strange or anything about keeping their ashes. But for some people, they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with the ashes or keep them or anything. You said it's an individual person.
Yes, ma'am. I certainly am with you. I think it is a personal choice, right? Just like a personal choice whether I want to be buried or cremated. You know, it's a personal choice, and it varies from person to person and from individual to individual.
Correct.
But I will also say that that is not an uncommon situation either, what you're sharing. Right?
But I think,
Who's going to keep the
yeah.
ashes?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, but I say, it seems like so many different things are weird, but I feel like a lot of stuff are more common. I feel like we talk more as people. I feel like we understand. A lot of people are just common. Like I say, maybe my grandmother, great grandmother didn't want to just keep the ashes in the house. Maybe she was like,
Right.
maybe she didn't, I think because they were together for a long time.
Right.
Maybe she didn't want to go and just look at the ashes like that. Maybe, like I said, when she came over, she would go visit them and talk to them when she's at my mom's house. But at home, I say I don't know. I think it's just me having to understand that people grieve differently than others.
Yes.
Exactly.
Very well said. Yes, they do.
Okay.
They do.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Stacy.
It has been my privilege. I appreciate it. And it has been a privilege, even though maybe we'll meet face to face another time, but being with you this morning is going to be one of the highlights of my day.
Well, thank you. Thank you. A little background on myself. I'm a nurse, and I worked in the ICU for almost 20 years. So
Wow.
I've definitely seen a lot of death and mourning and people's different reactions. Some people are super angry, and some people are super sad. And so I've seen a lot of it, but it really doesn't hit home until you're the individual in it.
Yes, ma'am.
So, and I've worked closely with your coworkers up there. I'm sure when I was still in the ICU, and then as I became a case manager, I've worked with some of the nurses there. Lana is one of them.
Yes.
Keith, I know well.
Uh-huh.
Stephanie, she actually worked on the floor with me before. So, and I just want to say I appreciate you all as chaplains so much, because at Mother Francis, they were a lifeline for us.
Yes, ma'am.
You know, especially when it came to these, you know, the decisions and things that needed to be made. So you all are just so important to me, and I appreciate your service.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And it's interesting because my wife is a nurse.
Okay.
And she was a nurse at Mother Francis before she went into the hospice industry as a nurse. And I did my chaplain residency, a 1-year residency at Mother Francis.
Really?
Yes, ma'am.
When was this?
Let's see, 8 years ago, I think it was.
Wow. And who knows? We may have crossed each other's paths.
I was just-
I see you very much.
I was fixing to ask you, how long has it been since you were at Mother Francis?
It's been about 8 months ago.
I bet
We've crossed each other's paths at some point in time.
I bet we've met, because most of that year as a resident, I was the deep night chaplain. So I spent a lot of time in the heart hospital, ICU, and the ER, because I worked. My 40 hours a week, which was part of the residency, was from 10 o'clock at night until 8 the next morning. I worked 4 tens and then did my school part during the day. But I'll bet we have met.
We may have, yeah. And I would talk to Keith all the time, and it was another young lady that worked with him as well. She had blonde hair, but she moved. Her and her husband moved somewhere, and I cannot think of her name right now. And worked closely with Dr. Ferguson. I've worked with all of them. Dr. Gunther.
Yes.
And it's just such a special process. I have such respect for them. I especially have a lot of respect for, I don't know if you know Cammie Bettle.
Yes, ma'am.
And I just have so much respect for her, because to me, her job was tougher than mine. I mean, that is such a sensitive subject for people.
Right.
And to be able to approach that and help people keep their dignity and things in their last days. It's just a blessing to have y'all.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. May I pass that along?
Yes, definitely.
And thank you for the many, many lives that you have touched over your 20 years there at Mother Francis as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I hope
It's such a pleasure talking to you.
a pleasure talking to you, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. And I would imagine, I'll take the risk to say this, that you're probably really, really proud of this fine young man that is sitting across from me today.
Very much so. I would have never guessed in a million years he'd be sitting up there talking about this, and how it all just comes back full circle, and it was really a blessing.
Myself as well. Thank you, and grace and peace to you, and Christopher, to you as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.
All right. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
No problem, man.
It was my pleasure.